So for everyone that's with us today, that's live with us on Facebook, that's here with us in Zoom, super excited to be here today for another free webinar brought to you by Krista McAuliffe, School of Arts and Sciences. So Julie, thank you for joining us. So I'm really excited to have my friend Covington with us today because I've known Covington for about 3 to 4 years now. And I first met Covington at Stanford Design School, and he's absolutely a brilliant man. And I've seen him do all these incredible things over the years. He is the owner at this moment of Stupid Good Coffee Shop in Dallas, Texas. He's a web developer, a business strategist, and currently is a coach for Seth Godin's Alt MBA, which he and I just went through that program, and it's really quite good. So Covington, really excited to have you here. We're going to be talking about reframing failure, which is something that you and I know is one of the key components of being a successful entrepreneur. And through the entrepreneurs that I've interviewed with my podcasting career and those that you've worked with as well, for all the successes that we have and people have, there's a list of failures, a litany of failures behind them, of which they've learned through to then get them to where they are today. So for those who don't know me, my name is Mark Guay. I'm the host of Your Life on Purpose, top-rated podcast on iTunes. I'm a creative marketing strategist here in San Diego, an Alt MBA grad, and I am the chief storyteller, the director of marketing here at CMA SAS. So Covington, I'm going to hand the mic over to you now, and I'm just here working as your co-host to sort of have a conversation about reframing failure and entrepreneurship 101. So Cov, thanks again for joining us today.
Oh, thanks for having me. When we originally talked about doing this and looking at entrepreneurship, the first thing that came to mind was just how entrepreneurs look at failure differently. I think that's a good lens to look at failure, and that becoming failure immune or having a better relationship with failure is the key to being successful in life or whatever you choose to pursue. So looking at entrepreneurs are a great example of how to look at failure, and entrepreneurs look at failure a little differently than most people. We have as a success, but that's not the whole story. A lot of them, like you said, went through a lot of failures before they achieved success, and it's something that isn't as exciting to talk about. So oftentimes it gets put on the back burner when they're interviewed or when they get written up or they write books. One of the ones being from Dallas that comes to mind is Mark Cuban. And when he wrote this book, How to Win at the Sport of Business, someone asked him why he chose that title. And one is obviously because he's big into sports, or the Mavs. But the other thing is he views it as a sport. He views it as the only sport where you only need to be right once. And in his book, he talks about how he had 20 failed companies before he created broadcast.com and sold that to Yahoo for billions of dollars. And had he stopped at any of those, he wouldn't have seen the success that everyone wants to talk to him about. And he found that the interesting thing is no one ever wants to talk about those 20 plus other companies. They only want to talk about that one successful company. So whenever he gets an interview or is asked to write, they always ask him to write about that one success. But he's pretty clear that that's not the key to it. It's building up that relationship with failure and to be able to keep going when you face a failure. Another one that's a little more timely is Airbnb. The Airbnb, the untold story is that company actually launched 6 separate times before it became the company that we know now. And now it's worth, I think they closed, and it was their last round, the valuation is like $31 billion. And they launched time and time again in multiple different conferences. And in one of the interviews, they talked about how they they learned something every time, and every time they didn't feel like it was a failure. It was just a project or a prototype, and they were going to try again and relaunch. That a lot of other entrepreneurs to materialize their vision, and they give up. But Airbnb is a great example of a company where the founders faced failure, and they were able to grow from it and keep going, even though they had failed spectacularly 5 times, 6 times before they were able to get it right. Um, so, the thing that entrepreneurs understand that I guess some people can learn from is failure is inevitable. So a lot of them view it as something that is a friend along the path. It's something that is to be encountered, and because of that, they view it differently. One person who's put it really well is Dweck and Duckworth, in that they talk about the mindset of dealing with failure. Specifically with Duckworth, she's able to look at the growth mindset, and she says that they view those personalities with grit view failure as not permanent. So they really have adopted a growth mindset, that failure is not something that is a singular event. It's something that is changeable. So that's something that I think is one major difference when we look at entrepreneurs and how they view failure. Failure is an opportunity. A lot of entrepreneurs look at failure as a way to grow or something to learn from. And sometimes, in the book Designing Your Life, they view it as a prototype. So you've designed it to fail, in a sense, that if it fails, that's not the way to do something, or that's not what the customer wants and what the market will sustain. So from the book, they have some beliefs that we commonly throw around when it comes to failure, and they encourage you to reframe that or look at it differently. So one of them is, we judge life by the outcome. So what happens? So if you didn't get the job, or you didn't make your numbers for the quarter, or you're not seeing the results that you want, you should look at it as life as a process. So it's not an outcome. It's something that is constantly changing. So going back to Dweck's work, it's really adopting that growth mindset and knowing that the failure is something that's not permanent, and it's just a prototype that didn't work. Failure is another way of looking at it. Failure is an infinite thing. So it's a process that's constantly going. James Carse, in his book Finite and Infinite Games, talks about that, and he pretty much breaks down everything in life falls into 2 categories: games that are finite, so they have set rules, and there are infinite games where there aren't necessarily set rules, and you keep playing it for the joy of the game. In fact, that's really the point. You have a game where you want to keep playing, and that's, for some, that's how they frame failure within the context of entrepreneurship. So life is an infinite game, or it should be a finite game with winners and losers. But a better way to look at it is life is actually an infinite game with no winners and losers. So you may have a few failures along the way, but they really propel you into where you want to be. So really what it boils down to is failures is the material of success. I know some entrepreneurs would say that they've failed more times than someone who hasn't achieved success has even tried. So that's how important failure is to an entrepreneur. to say that it's a raw material, something that's necessary, it's the foundation of a business or an enterprise is something.
Hey,
So
Cub, could I
yep.
pause just for 1 second? So we got one question here that I want to just bring up. Is how exactly do you define failure? I'm not sure if you're going to get to that in a little bit here, but one thing I like to bring up as well, when I used to teach in New York, I talked about this a lot, and actually you talked to my students about this as well. And there's a correlation between failure and just that F word of failing in school. Like, and it's just such a different way of looking at failure, because when you fail a class, it's a terrible feeling that we all can relate to. And, if you've never had an F before, you don't know what I'm talking about. If you've ever gotten an F before, you go home crying. I mean, even if you're a graduate student, right? It's a terrible feeling. But yet here we're looking at failure as actually, something that's helpful. So how do you define failure when someone comes to you and says, Covington, what do you mean by failure? What do you say?
So I think one difference, or one way I look at failure, is something that is a response. So you put something out into the world and it is an answer. Sometimes it's not the answer that you want, but it is an answer. And within the context of entrepreneurship, or looking at it through the design thinking lens, some things are, if that happens, that's in some ways a sought after outcome. So I think failure is one that either, so you're expecting one thing, but you hear something else. But ultimately, I think failure is just a form of response. The world may just be telling you something that you don't want to hear. But ultimately, I think it's what you do with that really matters.
And how do you usually help people? And forgive me if you've already spoken about this, but I just want to make sure that we touch on it. How do you say that this was a failure? And I'm thinking of Seth Godin's book, The Dip, right? Where there's so many people that spend 10 years doing something, thinking that, all right, there's 100 people I've heard of that have been the 10-year overnight success. We all know that. We talked about Chris Guillebeau just earlier. He's going to be speaking down the street. And I remember interviewing him, and he said, that he was just plugging away and plugging away and plugging away, never really sure that he was going to be successful, but doing it because he loved it. And he saw a modicum of success. He would see a couple of emails from people, a couple of comments from people here and there that would say, hey man, your work is really helpful. Thank you so much. And then eventually it just blew up. And overnight he became this extraordinary success, right? So, but sometimes that doesn't happen, right? And you just wasted 10 years. So one thing that's key that Seth Godin talks about, right, is defining or failing as fast as you can, or succeeding as fast as you can. And I'm wondering, how do you usually help people, do that? Is there a proven method that you come up with, or is it just a cognitive ability that you gain over time?
Well, I have an exercise we'll go through next. But I think one thing that is an essential first step is like you said, definition. A lot of times people either don't define what failure is, or worse, they don't even define what success is. So they don't know where they're going. So it's really hard to really know what's a failure and what's not. There's the idea of sometimes you may get the feedback where, like, the one thing you did wasn't necessarily exactly what you wanted or what the customer wanted, but it wasn't a complete and utter failure. So I think it's rare that something is a complete and utter failure if you've learned from it, or it's designed to teach you something. Like, do people want coffee to go in a plastic bag? It's kind of a contrived example, but there's a question that you're asking, and whether or not it's a yes or no. You could view it as a failure, but in the larger scheme of things, you're really trying to answer, like, how do we package this? So there's an exercise that's in the book Designing Your Life that by Bill Burnett and Dave Evans. Those are they have an exercise called reframing failure or building failure immunity. And we're going to walk through that. We'll take some time to actually walk through the exercise. I don't think we're going to have time to share our too many of our failures. But this is a way to really start building that relationship, that entrepreneurial relationship with failure. And it really breaks down to 3 steps. The first is logging your failures. A lot of times we don't spend time doing postmortems or identifying what went wrong. So we keep repeating the same things and receiving this. The next is categorizing them. So something that is just a minor setback or a screw up, something that normally doesn't happen. Sometimes that happens, we're human. Or there are opportunities where there's weaknesses. And those are really important to identify as well, in that sometimes just who you are when you're presented with a situation, that's just usually how you respond. And a lot of times people want to spend time shoring up those weaknesses, but from an entrepreneurial standpoint, a lot of times it's best just to avoid them or employ systems that can route you around them. And then the last ones are growth opportunities. So looking at your log, there may be some places where you find that those failures have a defined solution, or someone else has wrestled with this problem and they have a fix for you. And those are really important to identify, in that they can help you kind of transform or build this immunity or transform a failure into an opportunity. And then the last one is identify growth insights. So really capturing 1 and 2 and putting it into something that you can take with you, and it will inform your future processes. So I don't know if we have time to go through all that, but I can tell you, I'll share some of my failures. So when you first start logging them, you can choose any time frame, a week, this past month, or you can go for like the greatest hits, like the worst failures of your entire life. But I had one failure from my admissions days where we were supposed to run reports, and I failed to apply one filter, and really that came from a time crunch. I needed this information, and the person that I was supposed to get it from didn't have the time to create the report for me. So I actually ran a report which we based our letters off of. So we sent some acceptance letters to people who were not accepted to the university, which was a huge gaffe on my part. So totally my fault.
Was this when you were at Notre Dame?
Yeah. So
okay.
I guess silver lining is I was saved through the same, I guess, screw up, in that I had also missed another filter. So fortunately, the letters were sent to only graduate students. So it wasn't like we'd sent acceptance letters to undergrads. We'd sent it to like 19 graduate students that are like, this doesn't make sense. I didn't even apply. Why am I getting this letter? So it wasn't huge, and actually ended up being a good opportunity to start the conversation with those. So I'd actually like hazarded my way into a different group that we needed to reach out to. So those 19, we needed to reach out for another reason. So it was perfect to be like, please disregard that previous mailing, but we did want to talk to you about the coming year. So that was just a plain screw up. I think, categorizing it, I usually am more careful. I usually go through proper channels. And
Mm-hmm.
I think looking back, and it never happened again. We just was like, okay, we're gonna fix this. Um, another one that kind of fits into a different category that I would categorize as a weakness is I'm really forgetful when I make commitments, like time commitments. So I found that I need to, right when I make the commitment, put it into the calendar, and whatever's on the calendar is what I go with.
Mm-hmm.
So there can be no idle time between when I make the commitment and when I put into my calendar, because something always, an interruption, and then I'll forget, and then
Mm-hmm.
I'll get a call like, hey, are we still on for tomorrow? And
Yeah.
it's not even on my radar.
That's such a common one too for solopreneurs with scheduling. Like I know when I did the my first, so I'll share a quick failure as well. When I did the Traveling Cup podcast, it grew into a successful podcast, but the launch, I totally, flubbed on the launch. I didn't know anything about it. I just was getting into it. It was my first time testing the podcasting waters per se. And so I slowly grew my listenership over time. But then when I did my third podcast, Your Life on Purpose, I learned from that failure of screwing up the launch with the Your Life or Traveling Cup. And I did the launch well. And it was the first time actually learning how to get on the top 10. And it just was so much easier doing it that way as opposed to the long way that I did over 100 episodes of the Traveling Cup. But I will admit that I'm not the best at logging my failures, but I know it's important to do that. And one thing I wanted to share with our audience today that's been helpful for me is behind the scenes here, Covington and I have been talking once a week, and we're part of an accountability partner system. And so we talk through these things and we share, oh, well, I did this and it didn't work so well. And then Covington will ask me questions to help me dig deeper into it and figure out how to make it stronger from there. So an accountability partner, a mastermind group as well, super great skill set habit to get into, because it helps you sort of have those conversations about your failures. But Covington, for our listeners out there, how do you log your failures? And then can you go a little bit deeper into how to categorize them?
Right. I think the form it takes is whatever you feel most comfortable with. I have an Excel sheet that I put it all into
Mm-hmm.
because that's just how my mind works. But anything really will do. I think the more important piece is you get into a habit of doing it.
Right.
So to your point of not being very good at logging your failures, looking at it from a growth mindset, if you were to do it more regularly, you become better at being able to log your failures. When it comes to categorization, the three categories again are screw ups, weaknesses, and growth opportunities. I think the weakness one, or the growth opportunity one, is probably the easiest one to start with, to identify, in that when you have a failure, it's easy. It's pretty apparent that that's an opportunity for growth if it's a solved problem. So for me, it's, with a calendar, or not keeping a point, not remembering what commitments I've made, and setting up systems for me to get better at using the calendar or using the tool, I think was a key, growth opportunity for me. Screw to identify. It's something that it's a one-off. Like, you're usually really good at being on time or making sure that, everyone is accounted for, or, so sometimes, or remembering birthdays. There was one time I had it and it was a complete screw up on my part, where I had set an appointment and it was there, but I had switched, or I upgraded my phone and the calendar didn't come over exactly. So, I was operating off of incomplete calendar, and I
Mm-hmm.
missed I think that was just a one-time thing. Didn't want to spend too much time. I apologized to my friend and moved on and tried to be better about that. And the weaknesses, I think, they're the hardest to wrestle with, in that the practice of it, I think, will surface. Oh man, I'm always late, or I think there's things where this it's something that, even when you look at trying different solutions, you still come to repeating the same mistakes. I think the solution for that, from an entrepreneur standpoint, is really, maybe you shouldn't be doing that job. So can you delegate that to someone else?
Right.
Or just avoid the situation that causes those failures.
Right. And delegation is so important for the entrepreneur. Hey, Covington, we got a question here from Estepue. And he asks, what happens if you log your wins, successes in the same way as failures?
I think there's a benefit to that. There's a lot of research on the gratitude journal and expressing those. I think there's a lot of positives to that. But at the same time, people have a stronger response to failure, that I think you need to be able to, you need to do both. And if you can only do one, failure logging is important, in that it's going to help you change how you view it, versus your wins. I think it's important to acknowledge them and be grateful for it. And some would say that, and some entrepreneurs have wrote this mindset, where it's like, you don't really learn too much from failure, you learn what not to do. So logging successes, you may be able to identify patterns of things that work really well, that when you see them all together, I can see like, oh wow, I didn't notice that all these things that have garnered success for me, they all have this pattern. So I can see how logging successes or wins would be helpful. So I think this practice would lend itself really well to that as well.
So Covington, one thing I want to bring up here is, this is something that we focus a lot with CMSES with our students. And I know when we were in the classroom as well, we did this as well as teachers. And it's just that simple idea. And Carol Dweck talks about that in Mindset, of just shifting, of looking at failure as, to use a design thinking term, as prototyping, right? And when you just sort of look at it as a necessary skill or necessary building block to growing stronger and more talented in a field or in a skill set, it is it becomes a superpower as opposed to a weakness, right? And the one thing that I know we've seen in the education system and our experience in the classroom is so many students, particularly the very gifted academic students, they're terrified to fail because I know with your past in Notre Dame, this, that test scores are so critical, right? And so that student is craving for that valedictorian spot. And if they get a grade that, if they don't do well in a class, in their mind, there goes their chance to get into the Ivy League, right? Which is, great, right? We have a lot of students going to the Ivy League. It's absolutely fantastic. One thing that is good about our program I like to bring up is that we do work on a mastery-based system, so students can constantly improve and they could go back and get better, and of course the grade replicates that as well if they want to work hard for that. Not all schools do that, but is there any, I guess what I'm trying to get at as well is when you talk to students as well today, how do you kind of share this wisdom with them? Do you just sort of say, here are the 3 steps to, look at failure? Or is there a kind of an elevator pitch that you give to students to say, hey, it's okay. You have a couple kids, if they come home and they say, Daddy, I failed or something like that. I mean, how are you going to help them look at failure a little bit differently?
Yeah, I think the logging and the categorization helps. I think another thing that we touched on earlier is definition. Sometimes to fail at someone else's measure or game is okay. That I think if you can identify what success is and kind of write your own rules, so to speak,
Mm-hmm.
I think entrepreneurship is a um, great realm that you could explore that, and that's what that that area affords you. You can kind of write your own rules, and sometimes you will meet a lot of failure, and you won't be able to play the game anymore. But it's a game that you've written the rules. I think that's where I would look. Moving into growth opportunities is the goal. So being able to look at something, whether it's even, I think this applies as well to success. Like, okay, it's okay to it's great to get the A, or it's great to get the contract, but it's also important to understand or identify, why that's important, or where does that take you. That sometimes on the flip side of it, you'll spend a lot of time pursuing something, but not necessarily realizing what it's for, or what you want,
Mm-hmm.
once you've achieved it or attained it. So,
Okay. The one thing too that I found as well is just simply calling it a prototype. It's so funny how we get so stuck on words, right? And when you say, well, that prototype didn't work, it all of a sudden isn't as scary, right?
mhm.
We have a question here from Julie, and I'm going to read it verbatim. It says, what about failures that you have to go back to, you can't necessarily avoid? So an example is a student who has tried to complete their education, but find it hard to succeed, but also needs that degree, of course, to succeed, right? So her question is, how do you find the motivation to continue working on a failure? So you can't just push it aside. You have to come back at it. So a class here is an example, right? A class that's necessary for a degree. How do you work on your motivation? We have obviously the mindset here, but what else? What else can we do to help continue to motivate that child?
Yeah, I think, looking at, the entrepreneurs that we highlighted, there are those that they're in it for different reasons. And when they encounter a failure, they may not have the grit or wherewithal to keep going because they really, they may not understand or have identified why they're doing it. So even looking here, there's some assumptions or with this question of needs the degree to succeed. Like where does that come from? There are plenty of people who've been successful. And maybe it took them a few more failings, and maybe a formal or traditional education could have helped them mitigate some of those failures. But ultimately, they were some of those founders of like Apple and
Mm-hmm.
Dell, and no, I think Dell, he went to Princeton. But you look at some founders that have achieved success, but without a traditional degree. I think different people learn in different ways. So trying to find an answer here, if you've structured the why well enough, so going kind of alluding to Simon Sinek's, start with why. The student will find the motivation because they have an intrinsic motivation for that, and it's really helping the student define that's important, because that's kind of going to set the foundation for these failures, and really allow you to look at them in a different from a different perspective or under a different light.
Mm-hmm. Great, thanks, Joe.
I'd add to that that this day and age, the fact that we're here and doing this, Um, there are people who have made success out of very odd things this day and age. So um, the world is changing, and consequently the I guess target area of success is very broad and diverse now.
Absolutely, yeah. So, Covington, I want to take just a couple minutes here. And were there any other slides that you wanted to show? I wanted just to make sure we had just a couple more minutes here for any more Q&A.
No, I think this is. I just want to end with this quote. It's from Designing Your Life. As like, this. You talk about life design and the whole idea of a life worth living. If life went perfectly to plan every time, it'd be pretty boring. So the fact that there is failure, that there is this this chance that it might not work. That's where real life is. Like that's what makes life interesting. So they had this quote in there about life design where there are no wrong choices, there's no regret, just prototypes. That some succeed. And I think this is a beautiful quote in that looking at failure and assuming you can get to a point where you view failure in a healthy way. It begs the question of like, what would you do, or what could you accomplish if you knew you couldn't fail. I think that's really what a lot of times people are seeking with formal education or trying to get certifications. They're trying to ensure themselves that they or give themselves that feeling of, I can do this, that I can't fail,
Right.
I'm prepared.
Right.
And really that's a mindset thing.
Right.
You don't necessarily need to, that's not the only path to achieve that.
Right. Right. And we have one question I want to get to in a second. I just want to bring up a point too that really shook me when I thought about it. And I always used to share this with my kids, is there's kind of like a misconception as well that the safe route will always be successful. However, kids define the safe route, right? And I said, well, what if you fail the safe route? Right. And so, one of my students put it perfectly when he just said, well, I would rather fail at doing something that I really care about than failing at something that I don't really care about. Right. Mm-hmm. And I just thought that was just a really simple, poignant way of just putting it into perspective that you can fail at anything that you do. Right. And there really is no complete safe trajectory. So if you're going to go for something, if you're going to put everything behind it, go towards the thing that you care about the most. Okay, so we have one last question here from Estepew. He says, what is the best example that you've experienced that you know from someone you were close to of an epic fail that they turned around? So I know we talked about, well, actually, no, that wasn't an epic fail. I'm trying to think of any that I know as well. Well, I mean, Tony, I think of Tony Robbins right away. I mean, but his story is pretty, I don't want to say common, but I mean, he was 32 and he was, obese and very depressed and living in an apartment in Santa Monica, California, I recall. And then he had a shift in his mind and just went out for a long run, very hard, collapsed on the beach from, running too hard, and then he turned his life around, and then and he was depressed because of the job that he was in. He hated what he was doing, right? But that's a common one, and I don't know him personally, obviously. But Covington, do you know any that you can think of at the moment?
I think the question, not any that come to mind readily, in that there's so many. I think the question behind the question is like, why we tell these stories or really resonate or them is to learn from them. And the reality of it is you you probably, with your own stories, with your own failures, that's where you have the most to gain. That looking at other people's failures, it's not the same. You weren't there. You don't feel the same things that they felt. Situation that they're dealing with, same constraints, same, things that don't make it to the story. That I don't find them to be all that helpful. They're great. They're great to listen to, and they can be inspiring. But at the same time, I've met many people that are very knowledgeable. They can pull from a very deep well of knowledge, but aren't very good at dealing with failure. Whereas you meet people who, may not be as talented in that area, but they've either gone through a lot of failure, or are really, really good at, learning from failure, even if they don't have too many, but that's kind of rare. That's where the magic is. That there's not going to be any story that I tell you that is going to change your life. Really, it's the stories that you tell yourself. It's the experiences that you have. And going through an exercise like this, or there's tons of other ways to really look at your experience and pull out things that you want to carry with you as you continue the process or the journey. So I think that's more important. Not that there's any particular story or any particular framework. It's the act and the practice. You'll get better at it with.
Great. Hey, Covington, I want to make sure that our listeners here, either present with us live now or those that will watch this recorded on Facebook and YouTube later, I want to make sure that they're able to get a hold of you if there's any other questions or any other follow-up that they want to follow up with. So what's the best way for our listeners to get in touch with you and follow your progress in your own entrepreneurial work? Besides, of course, stopping for a coffee in Stupid Good, Dallas, Texas.
Yeah, if you're ever in Dallas, Texas, Stupid Good Coffee is a great place.
Which, by the way, for our audience, I've been not so subtly drinking my Stupid Good coffee here, so which is quite good.
And just the usual places, Twitter, so Covington Doan, on Twitter, Covington at covingtondoan.com. It's probably the best way. I really like having one-on-one conversations, and I check email a lot, because that's just how the workflow is.
Right.
I do, so.
Okay, cool. All right, Covington. Well, thank you so much, my friend, for joining us here for this webinar brought to you by CMASAS. For our audience, thank you so much for tuning in. And if you have any other questions, please feel free to reach out to myself or Covington Doan. And I'm sure we'll have you back in the future as well, because there's definitely a lot more that we could dig into regarding entrepreneurship. And we know that, that's the best job security that we can provide for our students, is giving them that entrepreneurial grit so that they can be self-reliant and happy in the rest of their lives. So Covington, thank you so much, my friend. Very honored to have you join us. And to everyone that's listening, you all have a beautiful day.
Thank you.